Please join me in welcoming to the Distinctive Voices podium, Dr. Helen Fisher.
Good evening. Thanks for waiting. My grandmother used to be 4 hours early to the train station. I'm one of these people who's 3 hours early to the airport, and I certainly was. But anyway, the plane didn't go, and so I just pulled into town. So anyway, thanks for sticking around. I study the brain. I and my colleagues, Lucy Brown, Art Aaron, Bianca Acevedo, have now put over 75 people who were madly in love into a brain scanner. 17 who were happily in love, 15 who had just been rejected in love, and 17 who were in love long-term, people in their 50s who reported that they were still in love, not just loving, but in love with their partner long-term. You know, we believe in America that you can't sustain feelings of intense romantic love. Well, we certainly have proved that not right. That's not correct. You can do it. You got to pick the right person. And so anyway, after writing my fourth book on romantic love and attachment and the sex drive, Match.com came to me, the internet dating site, in 2005 and asked me to meet with them. And I got to the meeting and they all filed in the door. I really couldn't figure out who was who. Maybe I couldn't figure out whether this was a think tank, whether there were more academics, whatever it was. But anyway, it ended up being the CEO on down. And in the middle of the morning, they asked me, why do you fall in love with one person rather than another? And I said, I don't know. Nobody knows. But anyway, that led to my delving into that question also. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to first talk about romantic love, what it is, where it came from, how it evolved, what happens in the brain, and then go on to and try to shed some light onto that question of why him, why her, why you fall in love with one person rather than another. In the jungles of Guatemala, there stands a temple. It is built by the grandest Sun King of the grandest city-state Tikal, of the grandest New World empire, the Maya. His name was Quetzalcoatl. He stood over 6 feet tall. He lived into his 80s, and he was buried beneath this monument in or around 720 AD. And Mayan inscriptions proclaim that he was deeply in love with his wife. She died young, so he built a temple for her facing his. And every year, exactly at the spring and autumn equinox, the sun rises behind his temple and perfectly bathes her temple with his shadow. And as the sun sets, it perfectly bathes his temple with her shadow. Today, some 1,300 years later, these lovers still touch from the grave. Around the world, people love. They sing for love. They dance for love. They compose songs and poems and stories and ballets and operas and movies about love. They retell myths and legends about love. They have love charms, love potions, and love magic. They pine for love, they live for love, they kill for love, and they die for love, as one of the most powerful brain systems that the human animal has ever evolved. And in fact, I was talking with a friend some time ago. Most anthropologists, most people do not study romantic love scientifically. I had an academic friend who didn't believe me. He then proceeded to go on to look for romantic love in 170 societies, and he found it in every one. There's no negative evidence. Every single place that an anthropologist has actually looked, they've found evidence of romantic love. In spite of that, I wanted to do start out myself with the questionnaire. I did a questionnaire on romantic love. I had some Japanese and Americans answer it. And to be sure myself that, this was a cross-cultural phenomenon. And I very clearly found that no gender differences in this passion. In all of our brain scanning, I found no differences between men and women in romantic love. As a matter of fact, I've been trying America, I seem to be a voice of one, that men are just as romantic as women are. We found no gender difference ever. In fact, men are 2.5 times more likely to kill themselves when a relationship is over. I don't know how romantic you regard that as, but men also have many more intimate conversations with their wives than women do with their husbands, because women have their intimate conversations with their girlfriends. I recently did a study with Match.com of 6,000 Americans. It's the first in America to be a very broad, it was based on the US Census, so we had the right number of blacks, whites, Asians, the right number of people from every age group, gay, straight, etc. And sure enough, men are just as interested in commitment, just as interested in marriage, just as interested in having children. Men are less interested in going on a vacation with their male friends than women are with their female friends. There's a huge amount of data that men are just as romantic as women are. Also, romantic love can occur at any age. I sort of discovered this when I was making a speech to mothers in New York City. It was a couple years ago, and it was during the day, and in the middle of the speech I asked, does anybody have a child who's in love? And a woman said, yes, she did. She said she had a little boy, and every single time a particular little girl would come over to his house, their house, he would just sit next to the little girl and stroke her hair. And when she left, the little boy would be depressed for about 1.5 hours. So I said to the mother, I said, well, how old is your son? And she said, he's 2.5. So this is a brain system like the fear system. We're not talking about the sex system. It's a brain system like the fear system. You can be scared at any age, and you can be in love at any age. In fact, the oldest person that I know who's madly in love right now is 78. So, in fact, I did my own questionnaire on it, and people over age 48 experience romantic love just as powerfully as those who are under 25. So it's a brain system that can be triggered at any age. Recent studies in England by a guy called Semir Zeki discovered that gays and straights are exactly the same. You know, we're not talking about who you fall in love with. We're studying how you feel when you love. And I had actually wanted to put gays into my machine, my fMRI brain scanner, not mine, Albert Einstein College of Medicine, years ago. But because we were the first in the world to do it, I needed to have a very, I didn't need any criticisms about it, so I stuck to straight people. But anyway, it's now very clearly been demonstrated that gays feel exactly the same experience that straights do. So I came to believe that romantic love was a human universal, and that if I began to study it in the brain, I might be able to find what was going on in the brain. I think it's one of 3 different brain systems that evolved from mating and reproduction. One is a sex drive, linked with testosterone in both men and women. W.H. Auden called it an intolerable neural itch. Pavlo Neruda called it an infinite ache or an eternal thirst. It's not necessarily focused on anybody. You can feel the sex drive as you're driving along in your car, or when you read a magazine or a book. It's not necessarily focused on anybody. Romantic love, I'm going to maintain, is linked with the dopamine system in the brain. This is what we've found. It is focused on one particular individual. As George Bernard Shaw said, he once said, love consists of overestimating the differences between one woman and another. And indeed, that's just what we do. And the third brain system is attachment, linked with a different group of neurochemicals discussed and discovered by other scientists. So I think that these 3 brain systems evolved together. I think the sex drive evolved to get you out there looking for a whole range of partners. I think romantic love evolved to enable you to focus your mating energy on just one at a time. And I think that third brain system of attachment evolve to enable you to tolerate this human being at least long enough to raise children together as a team. So they often are connected to each other. You know, when you fall madly in love with somebody, suddenly everything about them is sexy. I mean, the way she twirls her hair, the way he gets on the bus, everything about him is sexy. 3 weeks ago, he was just another nice guy at work or in your social circle. Suddenly, everything about him is sexy. And it's probably because, at least in part, as the dopamine system gets triggered with the intense romantic love, there's a positive correlation between dopamine and testosterone. So as the dopamine is going up, it's triggering the testosterone and the sex drive. So, and that's, of course, the whole evolutionary point of romantic love, is to trigger the sex drive and start the mating process. But can the reverse be true? Can you have some casual sex with somebody and then fall in love with them? Well, most liberated Americans have had sex with somebody and never fallen in love with them. But it can happen. And it can happen, I think, at least in part, because any kind of stimulation of the genitals triggers the dopamine system in the brain. And then with orgasm, there's a real spike of norepinephrine and can push you over that threshold into falling in love. So bottom line is, casual sex is not casual. Unless you're so drunk you can't remember it, it's not casual. Something's happening in the brain. You're going to be turned on or turned off. And as a matter of fact, to try and prove that, I haven't written this up academically yet, but I've now done 3 studies of this. And one is this Singles in America study that I did with Match.com. And among I asked a question, you know, have you ever gone into a one-night stand with somebody and then fallen in love with them? And 15% of people said yes, they had. In another study, 1/3 said yes, they had. And in another study of, so the bottom line is, there's 2 ways to get the boy or the girl. You either, you know, spend 3 years discussing their college plans and their life projects, or you get into bed instantly and try and trigger these brain circuits for romantic love. I'm not advocating it. I'm just simply trying to understand this you know, thing that people tend to do. Sex, having casual sex can also trigger feelings of attachment. With orgasm, there's a real flood of oxytocin and vasopressin linked with feelings of attachment. So, and what was said by Susan was a wonderful introduction. In that I've long maintained that when you take things like Prozac or Paxil, you're driving up the serotonin system in the brain. Any textbook will show you that. High serotonin jeopardizes the dopamine system. And there's never been any studies of it. We know that, these drugs jeopardize the sex drive, the SSRIs, the serotonin boosters. But nobody's ever looked to see whether they also can jeopardize these other systems too. And it's something, if I live long enough or if I can get somebody else to do it, it's time that you know, I'm not suggesting, I mean, there's some people that need antidepressants. They need them to get out of bed in the morning and to create the loving relationships that they want to have. But a Harvard psychiatrist has recently suggested that something like 73% of people who are taking these drugs don't really need them. And doctors are not telling us some of these side effects in these very, very important systems in our lives. I mean, in fact, I wrote a piece for MIT, a book by MIT, and it seems to have gotten around. And maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks, I get an email from somebody telling me the following story. This is a perfect example of it. I think it was from Holland, but I'm not sure. It was a young man, and he had fallen madly in love with a woman, and they were having a very happy life together. And then he started to do poorly in school. And so they put him on an SSRI, Prozac, Paxil, Zoloft, one of them, one of the original ones. And not only did he lose his sex drive, but he fell out of love with the woman. And he left the woman. And about 9 months later, he got off of the drugs, and suddenly this overwhelming rush of intense romantic love for this woman came back. And so he went to a store, florist, and he bought as many roses as he could carry in his arms and went back to her house and said to her, she opened the door and he said, you know, I think it was the drugs. Will you take me back? But I get this kind of story, tragic stories. People who've been married, I've got one on my computer right now, a guy who's been married for 12 years. Or maybe even longer, because he has something like 3 children. And it was a wonderful marriage until she started to take these drugs, and now she's walked out, and everybody in the family says she's a very different person because of it. So bottom line is, these 3 brain systems are connected. They're connected in very sophisticated ways that evolved millions of years ago. It's time we begin to take a look and understand them and respect them as real systems. And we've been spending our lives studying depression, which is important, fear, anxiety. It's time to study some of the positive emotions and see how they interact in our modern world. Not only do these 3 brain systems interact, but sometimes they don't interact, which can be a problem. You can, in fact, lie in bed at night and swing from feelings of deep attachment for one person into feelings of wild romantic love for somebody else, into feelings of the sex drive for some other people. It's as if there's a committee meeting going on in your head as you're swinging from one of these brain systems to another. And indeed, I think that because they are not always attached, it can lead to tremendous sorrow as well as joy in our lives. So of these 3 brain systems, the one that I have spent the last many years on is the romantic love. So I'm going to go rapidly through the various characteristics of romantic love and then on to what we found in the brain and then why you fall in love with one person rather than another. The first thing that happens when you, to come up with this list, I read the last 40 years of psychological literature. I also read a great deal of world poetry. I think, a lot of anthropologists will use potsherds or arrowheads or post holes or something to understand humanity. And I think that poetry and all of the arts are a wonderful window into the human mind. And so I read poetry from around the world, and sure enough, they all say the same thing. Come back to me, I love you desperately. The oldest love poem is from the ancient Sumerians, about 4,000 years ago, and it says pretty much the equivalent of please email me. So anyway, the first thing that happens when you fall in love is a person takes on special meaning. As one man said, he said, the world had a new center, and that center was Marianne. Suddenly, they are the center of the universe. And then you focus on them. Everything about them is special. Their car is different from every other car in the parking lot. The street they live on, the house they live in, the music that they like, the books that they read, everything about them becomes special. As a matter of fact, before I put people into the brain scanner, I would ask them, what do you not like about him or her? And they would come with the most trivial things, and then they would proceed to sweep those aside and just focus on what they do love about this individual. As a matter of fact, other scientists have now found that parts of the prefrontal cortex linked with decision-making begin to shut down when you're madly in love with somebody, enabling you to do some pretty crazy things. Intense energy, you can walk all night and talk till dawn. Euphoria when things are going well. Mood swings into horrible despair when things are going poorly. Intense bodily reactions. Stendhal once said, he said, when I would take her arm, it was as if I had forgotten how to walk. pounding heart, dry mouth, weak knees. At that moment when you want to be your very coolest and you can barely get out some basic hellos. Real emotional dependence, as Walt Whitman said, he said, "Oh, I would stake all for you." And indeed, people do. In fact, one of the toughest questions I would ask people, I'm not a psychologist, I'm an anthropologist. I don't deal in therapy sessions, and occasionally I do, but generally I do not. And so one of the questions that I found most difficult to ask these people before I put them in the machine, I'd cooked up the question, and I wanted to know the answer, but I had a hard time spitting it out. And the question was, would you die for him or her? And they would say yes, as if I had asked them to pass the ketchup. I mean, it was just, not all of them, but a lot of them. Real separation anxiety. I coined the term frustration attraction. We now know what's going on in the brain. When you can't get what you want, you just want it harder. You're waiting for him to call, fine, you're in pretty good shape. He doesn't call, you really want him to call. Possessiveness, ethologists in my field call it mate guarding. Causes, of course, a tremendous amount of crimes of passion around the world. But the three main characteristics of romantic love are craving for emotional union. Sure, you'd like to go to bed with them, but what you really want them to do is to call, to write, to invite you out, to say that they love you. High motivation to win the partner. What people will do to win a human being is astonishing. I had one friend who flew to Australia for lunch with a girl, and it took him a month to recover from that, but he did it. But of all the traits of romantic love, I think the most indicative is obsessive thinking. There's somebody camping in your head. That was the most important question that I would ask somebody. What percentage of the day and night do you think about him or her? And they would say, I never stop thinking about her. I go to bed thinking about him. I wake up in the morning thinking about her. I never stop thinking about her. So those are the ones I'd put in the machine. And machines are expensive. And it's also involuntary. Stendhal once said, he said, love is like a fever. It comes and goes quite independently of the will. And indeed it does. It's very difficult to control. So with those characteristics in mind, looking back at them, everything that is in red are traits that have been in the literature linked with the dopamine system. Bodily reactions is linked with the norepinephrine system, mate guarding with the vasopressin system, and obsessive thinking with low levels of serotonin. So just simply looking at this list, I just came up with the hypothesis, okay, if I look in the brain, I may find activity, elevated activity in the dopamine and norepinephrine system, and low activity in the serotonin system. So that was my hypothesis. Put together a team, Art Aaron from SUNY Stony Brook, Lucy Brown from Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and some graduate students. And we started putting people in the brain scanner. This is the New Yorker. You can't get two people in an MRI machine. But what happens in the machine is I would ask them to bring in two photographs. One photograph that when they look at that photograph, it gives them that rush of infatuation. Not the sex drive, but infatuation, real intense romantic love. And a second photograph of somebody who, when they look at that person, it calls forth no positive or negative feelings. And so I have them look at the photograph of the positive image, and I have them look at the neutral image. And then I compare the two in the same person. That's my control. The problem with that is when you're madly in love with somebody, you can't stop thinking about them. So I had to have a distraction task. And that was between the positive and the neutral, I would cast on the screen a large number, like 8,421. And they'd have to look at that number for 30 seconds and count backwards in increments of 7. Well, I want to tell you, that's a nightmare. For anybody, it's a nightmare. Drives all the blood to a tiny little part of the parietal lobe, but it cleans out the system. And so I get a nice neutral. I put the neutral and the positive on top of one another. This is a very, very simplistic way of saying it. Cancel out what they've got in common, and I've got the brain in love. So this is what we found. Found a lot of activity in a lot of brain regions, but large, particularly in a little factory near the base of the brain called the ventral tegmental area, in some cells called the A10 cells that actually make dopamine and send dopamine to many brain regions. And here's one of our brain scans of the VTA. And when I saw them, it began to occur to me that romantic love was not an emotion. I'd always thought that it was an emotion. It has a lot of emotions involved, and has a lot of cognitive thinking process involved, but it's basically a drive. It comes from primordial parts of the brain, way below the feeling and the thinking parts of the brain, linked with drive. It's got all the characteristics of a drive. The one that I find most interesting is that there's no facial expression. You know, you can look at somebody and know whether they're angry or sad or happy. You can't look at somebody and know whether they are hungry or thirsty. And in the same way, you can't look at somebody and know whether they are in love. And I also maintain that it's a great deal stronger than the sex drive. You know, if you casually ask somebody to go to bed with you and they say, no, thank you, you don't kill yourself. But around the world, people kill themselves or others over feelings of intense romantic love. It's one of the most powerful brain systems on Earth. So I think this helps to explain love at first sight. It comes out of what I call animal attraction. When you take a look at all kinds of other mammals, when they come into estrus, like an elephant, female elephant, when she comes into estrus, it's called must. She doesn't have sex with all of the boys. She, you know, a female doesn't have to do much to avoid a boy. She's got to move about 2 inches to the left or right, and that's it. So a female elephant will avoid a great many of them, and then suddenly she'll see a male that appeals to her, and she'll go a beeline for him, straight for him. It's an instant attraction. It's like a squirrel. The beginning of the breeding season, a squirrel's got to find another squirrel. She can't spend a month and a half discussing his nuts, his, you know, where he's I didn't mean it that way. And how good he is at collecting. She's got to get on with this project. And so when she sees a nice male with a perky tail and crisp whiskers and nice perky ears, the attraction is instant. And I think what's going on with love at first sight is that the person fits within what I call your love map. You're ready to fall in love, and a person comes within your ken, and it triggers this brain system very rapidly. It's interesting, in my Singles in America study with Match.com, I asked about love at first sight. Many more men than women fall in love at first sight, and it's because I think they're so visual. So I began to think to myself, having done that whole first study on people who are happily in love, I began to think, you know, who cares? I mean, people when they're in love, it's a happy time. What's important to society is the people who are rejected in love. That's when they turn into a pest, not only to culture at large, but to themselves and those around them. So I began to say, okay, my hypothesis was that love is an addiction, a perfectly wonderful addiction when it's going well, and a perfectly horrible addiction when it's going poorly. So it has all the signs of addiction, and so I began to look around for people who'd just been rejected in love but can't let go. Nobody can let go. If you're madly in love with somebody, nobody can let go. And so I began to get people coming into, and I began to put them in the machine who had just been rejected in love. And this is what we found. I was looking for this. I was looking for activity in a tiny little factory called the nucleus accumbens. It's part of that same reward system, that brain system for wanting, that is so central to romantic love. The VTA feeds right, the ventral tegmental area feeds right into this part of the brain. This is the part of the brain that becomes active when you are addicted to cocaine and to cigarettes. And it plays a role in all of the addictions. And sure enough, we found activity in the nucleus accumbens and several other areas. We found activity in the VTA. So people who've been rejected in love, they're still madly in love. In fact, the barriers make them love even more. 3 brain regions linked with craving and addiction. Brain region linked with physical pain, actually, and the distress of pain, and a brain region linked with feelings of deep attachment. It's a very bad combination. Rejection in love, I think, needs to be taken extremely seriously. So I think love evolved. I think it evolved millions of years ago. Charles Darwin thought so too. He once wrote in Origin of Species, "It was evidently a case of love at first sight, for she swam around the newcomer caressingly with overtures of affection." Well, unfortunately, it was a mallard duck who fell in love with a pintail duck, a duck of a different species. Now, that's a bad mistake. You got to get the same species. But anyway, Darwin and I, the only 2 people that I know, believe that this brain system for romantic love is very primitive. It's shared by all the mammals and the birds. There's every reason to think that it can be expressed in other species. They wouldn't call it that. I don't call it that in other species. I call it animal magnetism. Or it's very interesting. Anthropologists have long talked about mate choice in other species, and not an animal on this planet that'll copulate with anybody. They have choices. They have preferences. And I think those preferences come from this same brain system. And you can see other animals expressing it. Gorillas, orangutans, chimps, walking arm in arm. But the difference between us and almost all other mammals is that we form pair bonds. We form attachments. 97% of mammals do not pair up to rear their young. People do. And in fact, I'm constantly being asked on television and that all about adultery. And what I really feel like saying is, that's not the news. Every other creature is really quite promiscuous. What the news is that we bother to pair up at all. And indeed, we do. We're a pair bonding species. This is not to suggest that we are faithful, sexually faithful to that partnership, but we form partnerships to rear our young. So my hypothesis about that is that our closest relatives do not form partnerships. They don't need to. Females live in the trees. Is that really grainy from your perspective? No. It is. I'm sorry. They live in the trees, so they're protected. They don't need a mate to help protect them. Females don't. Females can provide for their young by themselves. They've got the baby on their back. And so they do not need a mate to help them rear their young. Monogamy only occurs, pair bonding only occurs when under a couple special circumstances. And one of them is when the female needs a partner to help them rear their young. For example, a female mouse has very thick milk. So she puts the babies in a nest. She feeds them with the thick milk. The babies conk out, and she goes off and feeds herself, and she comes back. She does not need a partner to help her rear her young. Most birds, all the songbirds, for example, need a mate to help them rear their young because somebody's got to sit on those eggs. And that individual will starve to death unless they have a mate. to help feed them. So pair bonding only really occurs under special circumstances. I think in humanity that occurred maybe between 4 and 5 million years ago. Trees were disappearing. Our ancestors were forced to the ground. We began to stand up on 2 legs instead of 4 in order to carry sticks and stones to protect ourselves and to collect food. And at that point, females began to have to carry their babies in their arms instead of on their back. I'm now giving you a theory. Nobody knows the answer, but this is my hypothesis. With the beginning of carrying and walking, females began to have to carry their infants in their arms instead of on their backs. And I don't see how a female could have carried the equivalent of a 20-pound bowling ball around for a good 4 years if I gave every woman in this room a bowling ball, a heavy one, to carry around for 4 years. I think that you would, too would begin to look to somebody to help you out. And I don't see how a male could have provided for a whole harem of females. And so pair bonding became critical to females and suitable to males, and we evolved the basic brain circuitry for human attachment along with extended periods of intense romantic love. And these are some 3.2 million year old individuals, but now we've found Ardipithecus ramidus, 4.4 million, and I'm not going to go into it, but there's some structures of the face and the teeth that indicate that human pair bonding, monogamy, had already begun to evolve. It's a very old tradition in the human animal, one that we certainly have around the world today. But so then why do we divorce? I wasn't willing to think that this was just societal disintegration and cultural malaise, that there's got to be some biological underpinnings. I mean, everywhere in the world where divorce is permitted and where women are economically powerful and can leave a bad marriage, and women and men can leave a woman who's economically viable so they can leave a bad marriage, divorce rates are very high. In hunting and gathering societies today, women and men tend to have 2 or 3 husbands during the course of their lifespan. So the human animal shows both long-term pair bonding and also serial pair bonding, a series of pair bond relationships. So I wanted to see why. So what I did is I looked in the demographic yearbooks of the United Nations and at 58 societies to see patterns of divorce. And as it turns out, around the world, if you're going to divorce, you tend to divorce during and around the 4th year of marriage. Now, there's always going to be variations, but that seems to be the mode, what most individuals do, the 4th year of marriage. And I couldn't figure that out. And finally, I began to look at pair bonding birds and mammals. And as it turns out, most birds and mammals do not pair up for life. They form a pair bond only long enough to rear the young through infancy. For example, a robin or a bluebird. They form a pair bond in the spring. They stay together until the babies fly away in the middle of the summer, and then the pair bond breaks up. They form a new pair bond next year when the breeding season starts again. Same thing with foxes. Male and female fox pair up in the middle of the winter in February. Female's milk is very thin. She's got to stay in the nest with the babies. Somebody needs to feed her. They form a pair bond until the babies, foxes, begin to walk away in the middle of the summer, and the pair bond breaks up. And it began to occur to me 4 years. If you're going to divorce around the world, you tend to do it during around the 4th year of marriage. 4 years is the human period of birth spacing. In hunting and gathering societies, we tend to have our children every 4 years apart. And my hypothesis became, well, maybe we have this natural tendency for serial pair bonding linked with the rearing of the young. There may even have been, and I'm not advocating it, may have been some Darwinian purposes to that. You know, you'll see a woman today who said, well, I was really a failure. I had 3 husbands and I had children by 2 of them. And I said, well, that's not really a failure, because you really, from an evolutionary perspective, you've created more genetic variety in your young. So there's 2 ways to do it. You either get a really solid marriage and have a lot of babies and stick with it, or you have a series of pair bonds and create genetic variety in your young. So I then wanted to figure out, and this was not my idea, this was a graduate student who then got her Ph.D. on it, and I was on her committee. She began to say, could it be that romantic love can last long term? And we said, I don't know, we'll take a look. And we had these various people in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s who said, I'm in a 40-year marriage and I'm still in love with him. So we started putting older people into the brain scanner to find out if they really were intensely, romantically in love with their partner. And Bianca is first author on that. Lucy's our brain, really reads the scans, and myself. And sure enough, among these people, all in their 50s and 60s, all married an average of 21 years, to the same person, all of them with children, and we found the same activity in this ventral tegmental area, brain region linked with feelings of intense romantic love. We also found activity in a brain region linked with feelings of deep attachment. What was different between those who had just fallen in love and those who were in love long term was that in those who were in love long term, we found new activity in a brain region linked with calm and pain suppression. Whereas among those who had just fallen in love, we found activity instead in a brain region linked with feelings of anxiety. You know, when you've just fallen in love, you're anxious. You know, I mean, am I too fat? What did I say that for? How come I did that? You know, you're just, very anxious. All that, in a long-term relationship, that anxiety is gone, and it is replaced with a feeling of calm. So, then we did something only in the last few months. I'd often, I read the academic literature on happiness. What makes happiness in a long-term partnership? Academics just simply do not agree. There's no single thing, except for one thing, there's no single thing that academics have found that that they all agree on, makes happiness in a long-term relationship, with one exception, and it's called positive illusions. And what it is, if you continue to think 30 years down the road that she's this beautiful girl that you still looks like she did in high school, just as funny, just as smart, just as slim, no matter what she looks like, if you still hang on to those positive illusions, you will be happy. So, they were in China, and they were repeating, you got to repeat these experiments over and over to make it really good science. And we would put people in the machine, and then we put them in the machine 40 months later. And those that were still in love with their partner 40 months later showed activity in a tiny little part of the prefrontal cortex, and that part of the brain is sure enough, deactivation in that part of the brain is linked with the tendency to over-evaluate and suspend social judgment with positive illusions. So we're now beginning to find out the brain regions linked with happiness in a long-term relationship. So, why him? Why her? Why do you fall in love with one person rather than another? When Match.com came to me and asked me that, I said, well, I don't know. I said, this is what scientists actually do know. Timing is essential. We tend to fall in love with somebody with the same ethnic and socioeconomic background, similar level of intelligence, similar level of good looks, similar educational level, similar religious and social values, similar goals, and certainly your childhood experiences. But you can walk into a room, and everybody's from your background and level of intelligence and level of good looks, and you don't fall in love with all of them. So there's got to be more to it. So I began to think there's got to be some biology here. So I'm going to take a little detour and tell you something which is a metaphor for the main point of the next part of this lecture. It comes from what we know about intimacy. Women tend to get intimacy from face-to-face talking. We swivel until we're face-to-face. We do what's called the anchoring gaze, and we talk. That's intimacy to women. It probably comes from millions of years of holding that baby in front of your face, cajoling it, reprimanding it, educating it with words. Oop. These are two women having an intimate conversation. Men tend to get intimacy from side-by-side doing. As soon as he looks up, he'll look away. I think that comes from millions of years of sitting behind that bush on the African grasslands, trying to hit that buffalo in the head with a rock. You can't be sitting there talking to your neighbors if you're going to do your job. And men tend to get intimacy from side-by-side doing. That's the problem. So the point is, you got to get to know who this person is. And so I need to know more. There's two parts of personality. I skipped that slide by mistake. There's your culture, which is everything you grew up to believe and do and say anything. And there's your biology. And academics now believe that at least 50% of who you are stems from your biology, like this feeling of intimacy. And so I said to the people at Match.com, I said, okay, I'm going to see what role basic biology plays in mate choice. You walk into that room, everybody's from your background, same level of intelligence, same level of good looks. You don't fall in love with all of them. And then people will say, well, we had chemistry, or we didn't have chemistry. So I said, maybe basic biology plays a role in mate choice. And here's what I found. So I went through all of the academic literature, or a great deal of it, looking for any trait that was linked with the biological system, any trait. And there's a lot of chemical systems in the brain, but the vast majority of them keep the eyes blinking or the heart beating. They're not linked with personality traits. There are 4 that are linked with personality traits. Dopamine and norepinephrine, very closely related, serotonin, testosterone, and estrogen. Estrogen actually produces oxytocin, so these 4 systems, each one of them is linked with a constellation of personality traits in the academic literature. So I thought to myself, maybe I could make a questionnaire using these personality traits and see to what degree people express the traits linked with these 4 systems. And then, because I was working with a dating site, you got to name these people. Now, we're all a combination of all of them. That's really important to remember. We are all a combination of all these. These are not cubby holes. They're brain systems. We're all a combination of all of them. But we have personalities. We express some more than others. So I figured, okay, individuals who express more of the dopamine system, I'll call them explorers. Those who express the serotonin system, I'll call builders. Testosterone system, the director. And the estrogen system, the negotiator. Not great terms. 10 million people have now taken my questionnaire in 40 countries, so I can't change the names, but I certainly would like to. So here are some of the questions on the test. I won't go into that. And basically, I'm just simply trying to say here, actually, that we're all a combination of all of them. This person was more expressive of the explorer or the high dopamine type and the high estrogen type. You can be very even on 3, you can be even on 2, you can be very over the top on 1 and low on the others. et cetera. So, in fact, I just had 100,000 people take the questionnaire, and no two people took it the same way, which is exactly what you would expect. I've never met two people on this planet who I thought were alike. I'm an identical twin, and even we are not alike. No two people are alike. However, these same patterns kept up, continue to prevail, even in these 100,000 people. So, bottom line is you can even be two people can be very high on the testosterone scale, for example, but one can express some traits in it while somebody else can express others. It's very complicated, but the bottom line is I'm trying now with the geneticists from Princeton to map out patterns of how people answer this questionnaire, and it's not random. Nature isn't random, and personality isn't random. And I'm trying to put together these patterns, but the four broad basic patterns are these four styles of thinking and behaving. So I'm going to go through them now and then talk about who's naturally drawn to whom. Those who are very expressive of the traits that are linked with the dopamine system, sensation seeking is what academics call it. Curiosity, these people are the most likely to go to college. They make the most money. They lose the most money. They're entrepreneurs. They're explorers. Mental as well as physical. I lived for many years with a totally wonderful man who died a couple years ago. As he got older, he really rarely left New York. We lived in New York. But he read 10 hours a day. He was very much of an explorer. He wasn't jumping off mountains, but he was very much of an explorer. These people tend to be optimistic, enthusiastic, self-reliant, independent. I actually had to make a speech in San Francisco this morning to The Economist, and I actually had the people in the audience, everybody took my questionnaire, and then they divided up into groups, and we asked the four different styles of thinking and behaving, each one of them to assemble in a different part of the area and to design a cover of The Economist. And the theme was the city of the future. Well, this kind of person, they all split up into, they didn't even work together. It was like a basket of crabs. They just moved out and did their own thing. They're impulsive, spontaneous, mentally flexible, idea generation, creativity. They are the most creative on average. In fact, if you give L-DOPA to a Parkinson's patient, quite often they will become more creative because tactical intelligence, they leap in with whatever. On the downside, they tend to be susceptible to boredom. I'm in there. I bring at least a month of work on the airplane with me. I don't know what's going on in the brain of somebody who's looking out the window for 5 hours. I don't get it. Reckless, unreflective. Americans, the therapy community, which I have great fondness for and speak a lot to, want to believe that we all care who we are. I really don't. And I once heard myself say to a group of therapists, about 600 people, I said, well, you know, I don't really care who I am. And out of the back of the room, somebody shouted, you want to talk about it? And I didn't. More manic, insincere, opportunistic. They can be very Machiavellian. As a matter of fact, I was dealing with people at Deloitte, the accounting firm, and I was sitting at dinner next to a guy who told me about, he had just taken a course called Teaching Machiavelli. And the first thing they did is they handed everybody some questionnaire. How Machiavellian are you? So he looked at all these questions, and he said, geez, you know, if I answer them this way, they're going to really think I'm Machiavellian. And if I answer them this way, they're going to think I'm a doormat. So he handed it in without any answers. And the professor said, well, you didn't answer this. And he said, those are my answers. That's very Machiavellian. and unpredictable. I did a study of, I've got 10 million, as I say, 10 million people have taken this questionnaire, 30,000 take it every week. So I have the opportunity to study them in many ways. So this is a study I did of 178,000 men and women. I wanted to know whether the words you choose to use reflects your biology. It comes out of something in the 1930s called the lexical hypothesis. And the lexical hypothesis suggested that you use words that really do not just what you say, but the words you choose to say it indicate a lot about who you are culturally. And I thought to myself, maybe biologically as well. So because I got not only all these answers, I've got all these profiles. I mean, on a dating site, you write down who you are and what you're looking for. So the top word used by the high dopamine type was adventure, energy, new, fun, traveling, going, outgoing, passion, and active. I think some examples of some real explorer types is Regina Dugan, head of DARPA. You can't lose your nerve. She lives in a world of risk, create, change, create, surprise, impossible, inevitable. She lives in a world of high energy creativity of the explorer. Richard Branson, I always had the urge to live life to its fullest. I've always thought rules were made to be broken. Now there's a guy who's just very high dopamine. And Lang Lang, the concert pianist, these are flair, dazzling, charisma, bravado, daredevil, extremes, ebullient, took the Royal Hall by storm. And if you ever heard him, he electrifies the room with his dopamine activity. So this is where they live. I only looked at 10 cities, not in Orange County, but they're the yellow. They live in the major cities, Los Angeles certainly, not in Houston and Dallas, that's for sure, or Phoenix. They live in the major cities where the action is. Serotonin, the second style, traits, the constellation of traits linked with the serotonin system are observing social norms. They're directly out of the biology. They like the familiar. They're not scared. They're cautious, but they're not scared. It's called harm avoidance. Calm is you take enough Prozac, you're going to be calm. Stoic, frugal, these are all traits linked with it. They like plans, schedules, and routines. They're orderly. I have a friend who goes annually to his accountant, and he told me this story about 10 years ago. He was with his wife, and together they went to the accountant, and during the course of the conversation with the accountant, he leaned on the guy's desk and just by chance moved the guy's pencil sharpener a couple inches to the left. And the guy behind the desk immediately moved it back. And now every single year that he goes and he moves the pencil sharpener. And every year the guy moves it back. Orderly, concrete, literal, details, details, details. Really pretty good, very good with numbers. Want to belong, more close friends. You take Prozac or Paxil, driving up serotonin, you will have more close friends. Respect authority, follow the rules. Religiosity is in the serotonin system. They tend to be more religious. Loyal. That's a really interesting one. One of the questions on my questionnaire, it goes something like this. I can't quite remember at the moment, but it's something like, would you rather have interesting friends or loyal friends? Now, we all want interesting friends, and we all want loyal friends. But this type can't tolerate unloyal friends. And the other three types can't tolerate uninteresting friends. It's a real divider of this biological style of thinking. On the downside, they can be closed-minded, controlling, rigid, stubborn, and moralistic. The top word they use is family, 178,000, caring, morals, respect, loyal, trust and trustworthy, got that one twice, and values. It's a particular style. Hu Qindao, president of China, is a very modesty seems to be in the serotonin system. Low-key, reserved, self-deprecating. In fact, on chemistry.com, these people can, chemistry.com, what I did is I ended up creating a new dating site with Match.com called chemistry.com. So my 10 million people come from chemistry.com and the international sites of Match.com in these 39 other countries. So one of the problems with the builder or the high serotonin type is they can be too modest. I tell them to blow their horn a little bit more. Cautious, boy, does he just like extravagance. He's really, and he's really got a moral code that he's spread all over China, the 8 honors and the 8 shames. In the United States, Ben Bernanke, I think, is a good example of the high serotonin type. And I think probably America's finest example is George Washington. I've gotten so interested in history, and a modest guy. He really wanted to just spend his time on Mount Vernon, and he felt it was his duty to do all this work for what became America. Very loyal guy. Actually cautious. His military leaders that he worked with regarded him as too cautious. Very community-oriented, meticulous. He had Mount Vernon, he knew every flower. He had it all, a long list of everything, and a highly social man. Sociality is in the serotonin system. So the third of the 4 broad styles of thinking and behaving are those expressive of testosterone, tend to be analytical, logical, very fine spatial skills. It's called understanding rule-based systems. Math, engineering, music is in the, a good, very clear understanding of music is often in the testosterone system. I don't have it. When I listen to music, I'm just swinging to the beat. I don't, but a good musician really sees the structure of music. They're experimental, exacting, skeptical, competitive, rank-oriented. They do something called dominance matching, which is very interesting. They'll attack, and they expect you to attack back. And I learned my lesson one night. I was in New York. It happened to be a black tie dinner, and I was standing there with 4 men. And one of them was a guy from the Wall Street Journal, and he was taking me to the cleaners. He was just taking me out. And there's 2 basic postural messages in the animal community, in the whole community: looking little, which is crouch, and looking big, which is loom. And the more he attacked, the more I went into the crouch. And finally, something snapped in my head, and I turned around to him. There were 3 others watching, and he was standing right here. And I turned around and said to him something that was vicious. It was vicious. And I don't remember what it is, but it was also funny. All 5 of us went like this. It's called the barred tooth display. Chimpanzees do it to it. You do it when you're nervous. And I thought, if he thinks like a woman, he'll never forgive me. If he thinks like a man, he may respect me. There was this long pause, and then he threw up his hand. He said, he started to laugh. And he's respected me ever since. Dominance matching. Hard to do, but attacking back is very effective with this particular type. Emotionally contained. They're the kind on television that's only moving their mouth, no facial expression. And if they're in a meeting, they're moving the mouth, moving the thumbs, but no other. They're very self-contained, direct, decisive, and bold. Get to the point. That's what they're most likely to say. On the downside, less compromising, impatient, more demanding. Mind blindness is an academic term for the inability to get into somebody's head and see what they're thinking. Less sympathetic and aloof. It's all basically traits that are linked with the testosterone system. The top word that they use is intelligence. There's a lot of different kinds of intelligence, but Americans define intelligence as a very focused, narrow, but deep view of something. And indeed, they've got debate, geek, nerd, driven, politics, challenging, and real. These are the top 10 words that they use. Real. They're the least religious of the 10 of the 4 broad styles of thinking and behaving. Larry Ellison is a perfect example. At one point, Craig, PeopleSoft thought I was going to shoot his dog. If Craig and the dog were standing next to each other, trust me, I have one bullet, it wouldn't be for the dog. He's made himself very clear. Very high testosterone guy. Another very high testosterone guy was Steve Jobs. The Svengali of the digital, a prickly, demanding, exacting, impatient. He actually has a very high testosterone face. The heavy brow ridges, the high cheekbones, and the very angular jaw are all built by testosterone. And I think Hillary Clinton is a very good example of a woman who's high testosterone, wanted to join the Marines, and when asked why she was attracted to Bill, she said, "He wasn't afraid of me." That's a high testosterone woman. The last of these four broad styles of thinking and behaving are those expressive of estrogen and oxytocin. They see the big picture. I call it web thinking. The way estrogen washes over the brain in the womb, if you have a lot of it, it builds more connections between the two sides, the two hemispheres, and also regions in the front and the back of the brain, giving one, I think, this global view. Very imaginative. It's a real strength of a lot of women. Very good at what they call executive social skills, verbal skills, people skills. Intuitive, we now know some of the biology of that. I won't go into it. Empathetic, pro-social, introspective, seek harmony, and emotionally expressive. What they call diplomatic intelligence. On the downside, they can be scattered, indecisive. They live in a world of it depends. You know, where do you want to go for dinner? Well, it depends. We can go here, we go there. Well, make up your mind. I'll make it in my mind. It depends, eh? Placating, ruminating. They think too much. Boy, they can really think. You know, I mean, one thing at chemistry.com, one of the problems is that these people will go out to dinner with somebody on the first date, and they see the way the guy uses his fork. And they start to think, oh no, he won't be good with the children, we can't do it him. The guy's thinking, are we going to be having dessert? Gullible, hypersensitive, and backstabbing. They'll never hit you in the face. Unforgiving, there's more receptors for the estrogen, a lot of receptors for estrogen in the hippocampus linked with memory, and effusive. Top word they use is passion, real heart, readers. They're the big readers of the world, learning, random. Like that word random. A lot of other types would not like it. Oprah's a good example. Bill Clinton's a great example of a male height estrogen type. Real synthesizing mind. The whole world knows he likes to talk, that's for sure. Real people skills, emotionally expressive. He's the one that cried at their daughter's wedding, not Hillary, and feels everybody's pain. Perfect example, I think, is Gandhi. He said, I had learned the true practice of law to find the better side of human nature and enter men's hearts. I do not think that Eliot Spitzer would think that was the true practice of law. And of course, Charles Darwin, who saw and connected every living thing on earth. So I'm wrapping up here. I looked at 500,000 people to see where these people live. High serotonin is all in the Midwest, tend to be more religious, tend to be more Republican. High testosterone is all around Washington, D.C., trying to run the world. Or they're out and gambling, that's a spatial skill. Or they're in Alaska shooting the animals, that's another spatial skill. Everything that's loose rolls into California. We got high dopamine here. And sure enough, high estrogen there's more universities there, there's more readers in those parts of the world. They tend to be more liberal and high estrogen types. So I think that these four broad styles of thinking and behaving evolved together through millions of years. I believe, oh yeah, Match.com wanted to know who you're attracted to. They don't care about all these brain types. They want to know who's drawn to whom. So I did a study several times of about 30,000 people to see who was, I can watch, the people are all anonymous, but I can watch who chooses whom, and they've all taken the questionnaire. So as it turns out, explorers, the high dopamine type, goes for people like themselves. Energetic, curious, creative, wants somebody like themselves. So does the builder. Traditional wants traditional. In those two cases, similarity attracts. In the other two cases, opposites attract. High testosterone, like Hillary Clinton, goes for high estrogen, Bill Clinton, and vice versa. Just to wind up here about the future, I'm going to eventually try to find some of the genetics of this. These are the 63 genes we're going to, oh dear, look at. This is by far the most important slide to me. We've now put 45 people into the brain scanner who've taken my questionnaire, and we're beginning to map out the brain regions that are literally associated with these broad styles of thinking and behaving, and they are exactly what you would expect. For example, with the negotiator, high estrogen type, we found more activity in brain regions linked with the mirror neurons, linked with empathy. I won't go into all of it, but for me, this is the future for me. So I do think that in business, I'm very for cultural diversity, but I also think we need more genetic diversity. In other words, when you put together a corporate board, sure, you may have an awful lot of people of different backgrounds, but they may think exactly the way you do. And I think we've got to move into a broader understanding really of what diversity is. So I will close with a story. The story comes, I was in Japan with Match.com. They had started a dating site in Japan. And so I went over with them and did a week of explaining all this stuff. And then the last night came. And on the last night, I spoke to my friend, my handler. I said, well, what are we doing tonight? And she said, well, we're having a get-together of the first 300 people who've signed up on the Match.com site. And there'll be a lot of press there. There's going to be about 400 people in all. And what you're going to do is first you're going to get up in this room full of people and explain the 4 broad styles of thinking and behaving. And then we're going to have a little icebreaker. So I show up, and the place looked like the White House. I mean, it was just big columns. It was white. It had mannequins and ball gowns and balloons and flowers. And everybody had taken my personality questionnaire, and everybody had a band around their wrist indicating their top preference, their top expressive thing. So, so I said, well, what's this icebreaker? She said, well, what we're going to do, Helen, is we're going to wheel out the bottom layer of a wedding cake, about 2 feet by 2 feet. And it's going to have some white icing on it. And we're going to get these people from the 4 broad styles of thinking and behaving into the 4 different parts of the room. And each one of them is going to decorate this wedding cake. And I thought, this is the nadir of my scientific career. I don't know anything about wedding cakes. So anyway, so I was at least 400 people. You couldn't see what was going on. They wheeled out the cakes. And the first cake, I walk over to the first cake, and sure enough, it's the negotiator cake. This cake was smiling at me. It was, please connect. Let's be friends. They even wrote love on it. It's just a very sweet, personal, estrogen-style cake. So I said, well, that's lucky for me. That's the first. And so then I go over to the builder cake, the traditional group of people, and I see this cake. It's very formal. It's very plush. It doesn't have the emotion and the connection of the other cake, but it's a wonderfully formal, it's probably who you want to do your wedding cake. One kiwi, one cherry, one kiwi, one cherry, one kiwi, one cherry. It's an orderly cake, as builders are. So then I go over to the high testosterone director cake. And this is what I say. There is no emotion in that cake. None. Zero. Self-contained. But they decorated around the cake. They're very inventive, and they thought outside the box. So then I go over to the Explorer cake. And the first thing that I see, the crowd divides, and the first thing I see is two men tossing fruit at the cake. And I come a little closer, and one guy looks up at me from behind the cake, and he grabs some flowers that are in a vase having nothing to do with the decorations and plunges them into the middle of the cake. And that's what we got. Thank you.